January 22nd, 2019. 27-year-old Emile Vollenhoven was thousands of miles from home. He and his girlfriend Brittany Homan had been traveling through South America for 3 months. But this wasn't some spontaneous holiday. They had talked about this trip for years. Back when they were students in Dunedin, New Zealand, they would spend cold nights planning all the places they wanted to see. Machu Picchu, Patagonia, Rio de Janeiro, Iguazu Falls. They saved money. They made plans, and eventually they left. Emile was a physiotherapist. He loved sports. He loved the mountains. And according to Brittany, he had a way of getting people excited about whatever adventure came next. Eventually, their journey brought them to Bolivia, and to one of the most infamous roads on Earth, the North Yungas Road, better known as Death Road. That morning, Emile joined an organized mountain biking tour. The route would take him down through the Bolivian mountains toward Coroico. It was raining. Still, the group continued. They rode down the mountain together, stopping at predetermined points along the route. Until, a little more than halfway through the tour, something changed. The group reached another scheduled stop. But Emile didn't. At first, the guides knew only one thing. One cyclist was missing. So they turned around. They began traveling back up the road, searching. And eventually, they found the place where Emile had gone over the edge. One of the guides descended roughly 100 meters below the roadway. But there was nothing he could do. Emile showed no signs of life. A trip Emile and Brittany had spent years dreaming about had ended on the side of a Bolivian mountain. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the story is this. Emile wasn't riding some abandoned road tourists weren't supposed to enter. He was on an organized tour. The company operating it had been taking cyclists down the route for more than 20 years. It said more than 100,000 customers had ridden with them. According to the company, this was its first fatal bicycle accident, because by 2019, Death Road had changed. Most ordinary traffic no longer needed to use the old route. Tour companies had turned it into an adventure. Safety equipment had improved. Guides knew the road. And yet, the mountain had never stopped being dangerous. Because beneath the mountain bikes, beneath the photographs, beneath the tourism, this was still the same road where generations of Bolivians had faced something completely different. They weren't looking for adventure. They were simply trying to get home. And long before Emile arrived here, this road had already earned its name. Its real name is the North Yungas Road. It runs through a dramatic part of Bolivia, between the high Andes near La Paz and the warmer Yungas region below. And almost everything about its geography works against the people traveling through it. Near La Cumbre Pass, travelers can be more than 4,000 meters above sea level. The landscape is cold, exposed, almost barren. Then the road begins to descend, and the world changes. The mountains become greener, vegetation thickens, temperatures rise, clouds gather around the slopes, and eventually, the road enters a humid subtropical environment. It's beautiful. But that beauty is deceptive, because the road itself was carved directly into steep mountainsides. Much of the old route was constructed in the 1930s. Workers created a narrow passage through terrain that was never going to make transportation easy. In some places, the roadway is only a few meters wide. On one side, solid rock. On the other, a cliff, and not a small one. Some drops extend hundreds of meters into the valleys below. There are sections with no guardrails, blind corners, loose surfaces. And then, there is the weather. Rain can transform the road. Water pours down the mountainside. Small waterfalls spill directly across the route. Mud forms. Rocks loosen, and thick fog can erase the road ahead. But decades ago, people couldn't simply look at the conditions and say, "I'll take another road." For communities in the Yungas region, this was an important connection to La Paz. Trucks used it. Buses used it, farmers used it, families used it, people transported crops and supplies along it, and that meant enormous vehicles sometimes had to negotiate a road that looked barely wide enough for one. When two vehicles met, someone had to give way, and Bolivia developed an unusual rule associated with this road. Unlike most roads in Bolivia, where vehicles normally keep to the right, on Death Road, drivers traditionally kept to the left. There was a terrifying reason. The driver sitting on the left side of the vehicle could look directly over the cliff edge, That allowed them to judge exactly how close their wheels were to the drop. Sometimes, centimeters mattered. Drivers approaching one another would slow. One vehicle might stop. The other would carefully squeeze around it. There was no barrier waiting to catch a mistake. And below them were reminders of what happened when something went wrong. Crosses appeared beside the road. Memorials to people who never completed the journey. Over time, the death toll became part of the road's identity. One widely repeated estimate claimed that between 200 and 300 travelers died on the route each year during its most dangerous era. That figure helped turn North Yungas Road into an international legend. But there's something important you should know about that number. Reliable year-by-year records proving exactly 300 deaths every single year are difficult to establish. So it shouldn't be treated as a precise annual body count. But what isn't disputed is that people died here. And some crashes were catastrophic. In 1983, a bus reportedly plunged from the Yungas Road into a canyon. More than 100 people were reportedly killed. It became associated with one of the worst road disasters in Bolivian history. But even that wasn't enough to stop people using the road. They couldn't. This wasn't a tourist attraction yet. There were no travelers arriving to photograph themselves beside the cliffs, no mountain bike tours, no action cameras. For the people inside those buses and trucks, Death Road wasn't something you conquered for fun. It was infrastructure. And for years, the question wasn't, would you be brave enough to drive it? It was, what other choice do you have? And if stories about real places like this are your kind of thing, subscribe, because this road gets even stranger. Decades after people risked their lives because they had no alternative, tourists would begin risking theirs by choice. And in 2008, one accident showed just how quickly everything could go wrong. April 2008, 22-year-old Tom Austin was cycling along Bolivia's Death Road. He wasn't alone. Two other British cyclists were traveling the route too. Daniel Roberts, 23, and James Marshall, 22. By then, Death Road was already becoming famous for something completely different: adventure tourism. People were traveling from around the world to experience the road that generations of Bolivian drivers had feared. For cyclists, the attraction was obvious. A dramatic descent through the Andes, hairpin turns, waterfalls, cloud forest, and cliffs dropping hundreds of meters beside the road. It was terrifying, but that was exactly the point. Then Tom Austin encountered a Toyota Land Cruiser. There were 13 people inside. What happened next took only moments. Austin collided with the vehicle. The Land Cruiser left the road and rolled approximately 100 meters down the rocky mountainside. 8 people inside the vehicle were killed. Tom Austin was also killed. 9 lives gone in a single crash. Daniel Roberts survived. So did James Marshall. Both were injured. But there was another disturbing detail. Tom wasn't even the first foreign cyclist to die on Death Road that week. Just days earlier, 56-year-old Kenneth Mitchell from California had been cycling the same notorious road. He fell from his bicycle and went over a cliff. 2 foreign cyclists, dead within days of each other, and suddenly, the contradiction at the heart of Death Road became impossible to ignore. This road had become safer for ordinary transportation. A new route was taking buses and trucks away from its most dangerous sections, but tourists were deliberately coming back. They weren't being forced to use Death Road anymore. They were choosing it, and thousands more would make the same choice. So why? Why would someone travel across the world, look at a road famous for death, and decide to ride down it? Part of the answer lies in what happened after Bolivia finally gave drivers another option. For decades, fixing Death Road wasn't simple. You couldn't just widen every section. This was mountainous terrain, cliffs, rivers, unstable slopes, a landscape where building safer infrastructure required enormous engineering work. Eventually, Bolivia created a safer alternative. The project took years. The newer route provided things that had been desperately missing from the old road: a wider roadway, 2 lanes, paved surfaces, drainage, bridges, guardrails. Most importantly, traffic no longer had to squeeze along the old cliffside route. By the mid-2000s, much of the regular traffic began moving away from the old North Yungas Road. The effect was dramatic. Buses and trucks that once had little choice could finally avoid its most dangerous sections. Death Road had lost much of the purpose it was originally built for, but instead of disappearing, it began a second life. Because by then, people around the world knew its name. Travelers had heard the stories. They had seen photographs of trucks balanced beside enormous drops. They had heard it described as one of the most dangerous roads on Earth. And adventure companies realized something. If tourists were fascinated by Death Road, why not let them experience it? Not inside buses, not inside trucks, on bicycles. The idea sounds absurd until you understand the geography. The route descends thousands of meters from the high Andes toward the Yungas. Cyclists begin in a cold, high-altitude environment. Then they descend, and descend, and descend. The barren mountains slowly disappear. Clouds move across the road. Vegetation becomes thicker, the temperature rises, waterfalls appear, and eventually the landscape becomes almost tropical. It's one of the most dramatic environmental changes you can experience on a bicycle. But you're experiencing it beside a cliff. The road can narrow to roughly 3 meters in places. There are blind corners, loose gravel, mud, water running across the surface, and almost no forgiveness if you lose control in the wrong place. Before the safer road diverted much of the traffic, the danger was even greater. Imagine approaching a corner on a bicycle and hearing an engine. You can't see what's coming. Then a truck appears. The road isn't wide enough for both of you, and beside you is empty space. When vehicles met, the vehicle traveling downhill could sometimes have to stop and give way. In some situations, a driver might have to carefully reverse toward a wider section. Think about that. You're driving a large vehicle. There's a cliff beside you. You can't simply turn around. So you begin reversing, looking for enough space to allow another vehicle through. Sometimes the distance between a wheel and the edge could be terrifyingly small. One mistake with the steering. Loose ground beneath a tire. A moment of poor visibility. And gravity does the rest. But the cliffs were only one part of the problem. Death Road had another enemy. Water. Warm, moist air from the lower Yungas rises toward the Andes. Clouds form around the mountains. Fog can reduce visibility. Rain turns sections of the unpaved road into mud, and in certain places, waterfalls spill directly from the mountain onto the road itself. So imagine being behind the wheel. A cliff on one side, a rock wall on the other, water pouring onto the road, mud underneath the tires, fog reducing your visibility, and another vehicle approaching from around a blind corner. This wasn't one dangerous feature. It was several dangerous systems meeting in exactly the same place. And that helps explain why Death Road became infamous. But it doesn't explain something else. Humans knew all of this. They knew people had died here. They saw the crosses. They heard the stories. They knew why it was called Death Road. And instead of staying away, tourists came. Why? Because humans have a complicated relationship with danger. We don't always avoid fear. Sometimes, we deliberately search for it. Roller coasters, skydiving, bungee jumping, extreme climbing, haunted houses, horror movies. We willingly enter situations designed to make our bodies react as though something terrible might happen. Our hearts beat faster, our attention sharpens, our breathing changes. The body prepares to respond. But there is an important difference. On a roller coaster, you're strapped into a machine engineered to keep you on the track. On Death Road, you are controlling the bicycle. And your brain knows it. A rider approaching a cliff doesn't need to calculate exactly how far the valley is below. The visual information is enough. There is an edge. There is no barrier, and beyond that edge, there may be nothing capable of stopping the fall. Fear forces attention onto the threat. You watch the road. You watch the rocks. You watch the rider ahead. You watch your speed. And suddenly, almost everything else disappears. Work, bills, messages, deadlines, problems waiting at home. None of them matter when you're approaching a blind corner on a narrow mountain road. Only the next few seconds matter. And when you survive that corner, you feel relief. You were afraid. You continued. Nothing happened. So you keep going. Corner after corner. Kilometer after kilometer. Fear, then relief. Fear, then relief. Until reaching the bottom begins to feel like an achievement. Not because you simply traveled from one place to another, but because you faced something that frightened you. That's the product Death Road eventually began selling. Not transportation, not scenery. A story. I rode Death Road and made it. But that feeling creates its own danger, because the longer someone rides without anything going wrong, the easier it can become to forget why the road earned its name. At the beginning of a Death Road descent, fear can actually help you. You're cautious. Your hands stay close to the brakes. You watch the surface. You leave space between yourself and the cyclist ahead. You don't know the road yet, so you respect it. But humans adapt quickly. After enough time without an accident, you relax. You become more comfortable. You learn how the bicycle responds. You may begin taking corners faster. The enormous cliff beside you becomes something you've already seen dozens of times. And something dangerous can happen. Not to the road, to your perception of the road. It begins to feel normal. The danger hasn't disappeared. You've simply become accustomed to seeing it. And on Death Road, overconfidence can be expensive. A mountain bike moving downhill carries momentum. The faster you travel, the more distance you need to slow down. Now add loose gravel, mud, rain, a sharp corner, a pothole, another cyclist, or a vehicle appearing where you didn't expect one. Suddenly, the amount of time available to make a decision becomes very small. Brake too aggressively, and you can lose control. Enter a corner too quickly, and your path can carry you wider than expected. Look at the scenery for too long, and the road continues moving beneath you. And people don't all respond to fear in the same way. One rider becomes cautious, another freezes, another makes a sudden movement, another becomes excited and goes faster. The same road can create completely different behavior in different people. And Death Road doesn't care which one you are. This is why the safest version of the experience looks very different from the reckless image sometimes associated with it. Organized tours typically use guides. Riders receive instructions. Equipment is checked. Groups are managed. Support vehicles may follow behind. The goal isn't to race, it's to control the descent. Because Death Road today is not the same road it was when buses and trucks crowded its narrowest sections. Much of that traffic has moved to the newer highway. That change matters enormously. But removing most of the traffic did not remove the cliffs. It did not remove the waterfalls. It did not remove the gravel. It did not remove the fog. And it did not remove human error. Which brings us back to Emile Vollenhoven. Remember how his final ride began? He was traveling through South America with Brittany. They had spent years talking about the journey. By the time they reached Bolivia, they had already been traveling for months. And on January 22, 2019, Emile joined an organized Death Road cycling tour. This wasn't someone secretly entering a closed road. This wasn't someone deliberately trying to perform a dangerous stunt. He was participating in the same experience thousands of tourists complete. The group traveled down the mountain. They stopped at predetermined points. And then at one of those stops, Emile wasn't there. The guides went back looking for him. They eventually found where he had left the road. Approximately 100 meters below, one of the guides reached him. But Emile was already gone. He was 27. And that's what makes Death Road difficult to understand, because thousands of people ride it and return safely. They take photographs, they laugh, they tell their friends it was one of the greatest experiences of their lives. Some even argue that its reputation today is exaggerated. And in one sense, they have a point. The Death Road of today is not the Death Road of its deadliest years. The buses are largely gone. The trucks are largely gone. A safer highway exists. Tour operators understand the route. But a safer Death Road is not the same thing as a safe road. And there's one detail about Emile's death that makes that distinction painfully clear. The company operating his tour said it had taken more than 100,000 people down Death Road over more than 2 decades. According to the company, Emile was its first cycling fatality. Think about what that means. More than 100,000 rides can end safely, and then one doesn't. That's how risk works. Safety isn't proof that nothing can happen. Sometimes, it's simply evidence that nothing has happened yet. And this brings us to the biggest question surrounding this road. Is Bolivia's Death Road really still the most dangerous road in the world? Because there is one sentence attached to it more than any other: the most dangerous road in the world. It's in travel videos, documentaries, tour advertisements, news stories, and for years, that reputation made sense. This was a narrow mountain road carrying buses, trucks, and ordinary passengers through unforgiving terrain. The road became notorious internationally. But there's a problem. The Death Road people visit today isn't really the same Death Road that created the legend. The cliffs are still there. The waterfalls are still there. The narrow sections are still there. But one enormous thing has changed: the traffic. For decades, this road functioned as a major connection between La Paz and the Yungas. That meant buses, cargo trucks, cars, commercial traffic. Vehicles traveling in both directions on a road that sometimes barely had room for one. Then Bolivia built the safer alternative. Once it became available, most regular traffic moved away from North Yungas Road. And suddenly, one of the biggest ingredients in Death Road's danger disappeared. Not the mountain, not the cliffs, the congestion. Think about what made the old road so terrifying. A narrow road alone is dangerous. A cliff alone is dangerous. Fog alone is dangerous. But combine all three, then put a bus traveling downhill toward a truck coming uphill. And you've created something completely different. Remove most of those vehicles, and the equation changes. That's why calling the modern road the world's most dangerous can be misleading. Its reputation was built during another era, an era when ordinary Bolivians sometimes had little choice but to travel it. Today, the old route is used heavily for adventure tourism, alongside some local traffic. And remarkably, the thing that once represented dangerous infrastructure became economically valuable precisely because it had been so dangerous. The name remained, the stories remained, the crosses remained. And tourists arrived. The road didn't need hundreds of buses anymore. It needed a legend. But legends can distort reality. Someone watching a video about Death Road today might assume hundreds of people are still plunging from these cliffs every year. That isn't what the famous historical death estimate means. Moving most traffic to the newer highway dramatically changed the risk. But that doesn't mean the danger is fake. Tom Austin died here. Kenneth Mitchell died here. Emile Vollenhoven died here. Real people, real families, real journeys that didn't end the way they were supposed to. So perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't, is this still the world's most dangerous road? Maybe it's, how dangerous does a place have to be before we stop treating its reputation like an invitation? Because somehow, Death Road becoming safer didn't make people forget it. It made people want to experience it, and that might tell us something uncomfortable about ourselves. Go back one final time to January 2019, back to Emile Vollenhoven, 27 years old, a physiotherapist from New Zealand, traveling through South America with Brittany Homan. They had dreamed about the trip for years, and for 3 months, they had been living that dream. Then they reached Bolivia. Emile went riding on Death Road, and he never returned. There is a temptation, when telling stories about places like this, to turn people into statistics. 1 cyclist, 9 dead. More than 100 passengers, 200, 300. Numbers make danger easy to understand, but numbers also hide something. Every number was somebody. Somebody had plans after the journey. Somebody expected them home. Somebody assumed that morning would end like thousands of mornings before it. And that's what the crosses along Death Road represent. Not the legend, the cost behind it. Today, thousands of people can travel this route and return safely. They photograph the waterfalls. They ride through the clouds. They stop beside the cliffs. They reach the bottom. And they can truthfully say, I survived Death Road, but that sentence means something very different today than it did decades ago. For a modern tourist, it can be a story, an achievement, something to tell friends when they get home. For the truck drivers and families who once depended on this route, surviving Death Road wasn't an adventure. It was Tuesday. It was work. It was taking produce to market. It was visiting family. It was getting from one part of Bolivia to another because there simply wasn't a better road. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part of this story. Death Road didn't become famous because humans discovered an impossibly dangerous place. Humans built it. Then they depended on it. Then they feared it. Then they depended on it. And finally, they turned it into an attraction. The same cliffs that once made passengers afraid to look out of a bus window now attract cyclists carrying cameras. The same name that once warned people about the road now sells the experience. Death Road. Maybe that's why places like this fascinate us. From a distance, danger becomes beautiful. Once we're protected from its worst consequences, we can turn around and admire it. But the mountain doesn't know that the road has become a tourist attraction. The cliff doesn't know that your bicycle has better brakes. The fog doesn't know that you're following an experienced guide. Gravity doesn't care that thousands of people made it safely before you. And Emile's story reminds us of that. A place can become safer. Thousands of people can survive it. The statistics can improve dramatically. And none of that guarantees what happens to the next person. Today, Bolivia's death road is no longer what it once was. The buses have largely moved elsewhere. The trucks have largely moved elsewhere. The terrifying congestion that helped create its reputation is largely gone. But the road remains, carved into the side of the Andes, descending from cold mountains into green forest, past waterfalls, past cliffs, past crosses, past reminders of the people who came before. And maybe that's the real reason Death Road still deserves our attention. Not because it is unquestionably the most dangerous road on Earth today, but because it shows how quickly humans can transform danger into necessity, necessity into history, and history into entertainment. And somewhere between all three. It's easy to forget the people who gave the road its name. If you enjoy documentaries about the world's most extreme places and the real people behind their stories, subscribe to the channel. There are more places on Earth whose true stories are far stranger than their reputations, and we'll find them.